Hi, welcome to day 5 of Blender introduction series. Today we are going to talk about how to set up light in Blender. Okay. In previous chapter we set up few materials and textures for objects we have built so far in this series. Now it's time we set up our own lighting from scratch and understand the tools available within this software. Okay. To begin with this chapter, we'll open the file from the previous chapter and just delete all the lights which are affecting the scene. Okay. You can just go to the solid mode, and if overlays were disabled, you can enable them so you can see the lights, or you can just look at this outliner and delete all the 3 area lights. Now, okay, I'll just make a duplicate of full scene, and now I'll just delete all the 3 area lights. Now let's render the scene just to make sure nothing else is affecting the light. And of course we have one HDRI in background, so I'm just going to, in the color, just disable this one by remove. Okay, click remove and disable this one and set the strength to 0. All right, now it's almost black, but we have few more things to take care of. Just select these filament objects and remove these materials. And also the screen of the game is also being affected with the emission shader. I'll rename this, and so I can find this later and remove this. You can also remove this one. All right, okay. Now you can't see anything because there are no light sources or no emitting objects. Okay, so this is what you need to start with this tutorial. All right, so if you select all, you can see all the objects are there but no lights are affecting it. Okay, all right, so now that we have our file set up, let's start with this tutorial. So let's talk about light. So lighting is actually one of the most important part of creating visuals and telling stories with them. It's so much more than just adding lights to scene and make it bright. Cinematographers use these great techniques to tell stories effectively. Lights can be used to create different moods, help compose your visuals effectively, and separate objects create depth in your environment. Different color saturations and temperatures can be used to evoke different emotions in the scene. And but these are all light theories. Okay, and it is interesting, however, but it's a very vast topic to discuss. You can research more about it later if you want, or maybe we can discuss this chapter in some other video where we just talk about the light theories. But it will be one of a very powerful knowledge to carry with you if you are into creating very rich visuals. Okay, now there are mainly two kind of light sources. One is the direct lights, and second is the indirect lights. Now to make this one clear, I'll bring up my another setup which I have created over here. Now if I click on the render over here, viewport render, you can't see anything because there are no lights. So what I'll do is I'll click on my sunlight which I have in the scene and enable this. Now what is happening here is light is falling from this direction. If you just enable overlay, I have this sun object over here and it's falling in this direction, and from these windows actually light is coming inside this room and falling on the floor. So that is what you're looking over here. Okay, but rest everything is looking like absolutely pitch dark, and this is not how the actual light works in the real world. Okay, now this doesn't look natural at all. That is because the global illumination is missing at this moment. So we were talking about the direct and indirect lights. So this example is actually direct light. What is happening is the light is falling on this surface, and that is what you're seeing, the only the direct interaction with the surface. Okay, now see what happens when I enable indirect lights. Okay, now there's a parameter in render settings, and by default this amount is set to 12, but just for this tutorial's purpose I made it 0. Now when I start increasing this parameter, you can see now light is bouncing from here to other walls, and this is called indirect light, and this is also called global illumination. So the more I increase this, the more number of times this light will bounce. By default this number in the Blender is 12. Now if you see, we have only this light source and there are no direct lights in this room, but the room is actually lighting up from the indirect light source, most of it. Just from these two patches actually light is bouncing around and illuminating the rest of the room. And it's not just the light which actually bouncing around, it's also the surface colors. Now if you have a look at over here, from this wall, whichever rays are actually bouncing from this wall, red color, are adding into other walls color as well. This wall over here, if you see from here to here, you can see there is a slight transition towards the red, and from here to here you can see there's a transition towards the green. Okay, and that is because the green rays are bouncing around from this wall to the nearest object, and so it's not just the light which bounces, but also it picks up the color from where the light is bouncing. Okay, so you can use these things when you are setting up studio lights. You can keep in mind like what kind of color bounces you want around your object, and set up a lighting with this. So these patches over here, these are from the direct light, and indirect light is whatever light rays are bouncing from here to the other surfaces. That source is called, the global illumination is called indirect light. It's a very popular term. You can study more about it if you want. Okay, I'll go back to my scene, and so in direct lights, there are mainly three kind of lights. One is the environment light, where you use very high dynamic range images such as HDR or EXR images, and you use these images to emit light in the environment. And second type of lights are the lamps, which are in all of the 3D softwares. There are lamp objects which you can use just like artificial lights in your scene. Okay, so the third one is the emission shader, when you turn the object itself into a light. Okay, so let's talk about the environment light first. Now if I hit render over here, as you can see, there is nothing happening at this moment. So what I'll do is I'll go through the different lights one by one. Over here I'll bring up the shader editor, and so to set up an environment light, you'll have to go to the world properties. So if you click over here, you can see there's a shader for the world output, which is called background. You can also see this in shader editor over here. If you go to shader editor, and from object, in object you see all the materials, but if you change this to world, you'll see the world shader. And so right now if I render this, nothing is happening because I don't have any color or shader. Now see, if I increase this to white, you see when I increase this color to some value, my environment is being affected by this. So my environment is at this moment a bright white, endless white light. Okay, so what I can do is I can bring up HDRs to affect this color. I'll press Shift A, and in texture I'll click environment texture, or you can simply click over here and bring environment texture and connect this to background. Now I need to find one HDR, so I'll click over here. So you can go to the Blender's default HDR or EXR folder, which is located somewhere in the data files studio lights world. Okay, so I'll pick up this city.exr. Now see what happens in the environment. I have this 360 world which is emitting lights. Okay, and it's creating very realistic result, and that is because the HDR or EXR images have very dynamic values. To clear this out, what I'll do is I'll change this to image editor and bring some simple image over here. Now if I click on any of these pixels, you can see over here when it's showing the value, none of these values exceed 1. Okay, there is R is 1, G is 1, B is 1, and that is when its pixel is absolute white. Okay, even though it's absolute white, still these numbers are not exceeding 1, and that is because this image is not a dynamic range image. This is just a bitmap. Okay, you can click on any other image, you will see these number will never exceed 1 from here. Now see what happens when I bring one HDR or EXR image. Now if I click on any image, any pixel which is dark, you'll see these values, very low values over here. As I move towards the brighter pixels, you'll see, okay, let's go over here. When I go to these pixels, so here red value is 526, green value is 206, and blue value is 18. which is way beyond like one standard white color. Okay, even though this appears white, this have much more energy than a white color. Just like how when we look at a sun, the sun is not usually white, it's the energy of the emission which is stronger. Okay, these properties what makes it very good for environments. So I'll go back to my 3D viewport and I'll change this to maybe sunrise. Okay, now you'll see, so now you'll see our scene actually looks like it is actually a part of that environment which is affecting it. Okay, if I choose any scene which have a very soft lights such as this one, now this scene, this environment doesn't have any sharp sunlight. You can see everything is some sort of average. Okay, and because of that, if you have a look at this road and our ground, it's kind of blending in very well. Okay, now if I choose something very intense light over here, okay, now you'll see my scene is being affected with a very strong light from this direction, and it's actually casting very long shadows just like in actual scene. If you see this grass, these are grass shadows. So for any exterior render or interior render, I think most of the time you'll always be using dynamic range images in your environment, and it's a very good way to start setting up your light. You can also use HDR for studio setups. Let's say if I open this studio.exr, then you'll see I have a studio kind of a setup in environment, and if you press Ctrl T, because our node wrangler is enabled from the add-ons. Yeah, so this will bring up these nodes, mapping nodes, and you can rotate your HDR and align where you want this to be. Okay, and also you can combine multiple HDR just like how we combine shaders. Let's say if I go to color and mix RGB, and let's say if I make a duplicate of this and add this to first, sorry, and here I'll change this to sunrise. Now you'll see I have the sunrise image as well, but the brightest spots from the studio light are also affecting my scene. If I change this to multiply, maybe I can see the environment and the studio light setup both. Okay, you can see these different modes actually bring up different results, so you can tweak these if you want, and you can align them the way you want. So maybe if I want my studio light somewhere over here, I can do that from mapping nodes. Okay, so these are environment lights, and I think HDR and EXR are the most essential things if you want to set up something very realistic. If you're doing outdoor renders, I think you can actually make entire render with just one HDR. So just play around with this, have fun with it, and now we'll move on to the next one, which are lamp objects. Okay, so I'll just make a copy of this scene just for the sake of backup, and I'll remove these nodes in the background and turn the intensity down to 0. So now our scene is back to black. Now second category is the lamp objects. Okay, like just like real world artificial lights, almost all the 3D packages have these artificial lamps. Okay, so you can bring these by pressing Shift A, and in the light category over here you can see there are 4 different lamps. Now let's have a look at these lamps one by one. I'll go to 3D viewport and change this one to render. Now I'll click over here and bring one point light. Okay, so it's a very simple 1 point emission object which is casting light from the 1 point. Now since it's a point light, when you change the position it will affect the scene, but rotation won't matter here because it's a 1 point object. Okay, now you can either delete this one and create a different light from here, either sun or spotlight, or you can just go to the object properties. You'll see when you have a light object selected, there is one this bulb icon in the properties panel, which is object data properties. And from here you can change the kind of light you want instead of deleting this one and creating a new one. So I'll change this to sun. Okay, now you'll see my entire scene is illuminated. It's the range of the light is actually limitless. And in this case, doesn't matter where I position the sun, the only rotation will change the effect of the light. Okay, let's say if I tilt this to something like a sundown. Okay, now this works like a sunlight. Okay, now the third one is the spotlight. Okay, if I go over here and change this to spotlight, you can see there is a light is only affecting in one direction, in one spot. Okay, now for spotlight, the position and the rotation both works, because this is not a 360 light, this is only working in one direction. And the fourth one is area light. And area light, you can have different shapes, rectangle, disc, ellipse. From here you can choose the shape. Yeah, so you can use area lights for setting up interior or studio light setups and all. Okay, so let's talk about these parameters. The first one is the color. Okay, now this is a very simple self-explanatory thing, and the color of the light. Okay, and now let's go back to the shader editor over here and go to the object. Now if you click use nodes over here, this will show us the node which is actually building this light. Now if I change color over here, now this will work like just like how we changed color over here. Okay, but you can do much more than that in this node setup. What you can do is you can bring one texture, image texture, and plug this one into color. Now what will happen is, if I choose just like HDR from environment, if I choose Studio EXR, let's bring up something better than this, and maybe if I press Ctrl T and rotate my light or position my light, I'll be able to see the effect better. So right now it's using UV. What I'll do is change this to object. Okay, now I think you can see the effect better. Now see, this light is now picking up colors from the HDR image, and it's much more richer than just using a flat color over here. Sorry. Now the third parameter over here, I'll go back to the 3D viewport, and let's delete this light and create one new light area. Second parameter is power, which is like intensity of it, and over here there is a size parameter. Now let's have a look at it. This one, this is a very important parameter over here. Now what is happening is, if I set the size to, let's say, 1, this light is creating a very sharp shadows. Okay, now if I start increasing this size parameter, you'll see the bigger the light is, the softer the shadow it will cast. Okay, and of course the larger the area it will cover. Okay, so you can use this parameter to control how softer or sharp shadows you want. And max bounces, you can leave this to default value. You can change this whether you want this light to cast shadow or not. Now let's create a few lights, and you can bring one over here. All right, now what I'll do is I'll create one more duplicate and place one light over here. Okay, just to fill this part and decrease this intensity. Okay, now sometimes you would want to add a light into your scene just to brighten a few areas, but you do not want a light to affect all the other reflections and everything. So you can control a lot about this from object property panel. So let's say right now I have this light over here, and it's also affecting the ground reflection. Okay, but I want this light to only, the intensity should only work, but this should not affect the reflections. Okay, so what I can do for that is I can go back to object properties, and this is not just for light. You can do this with any kind of object. Okay, so you can see in the visibility option over here there are several properties. One is the ray visibility and the viewport visibility. Okay, now one is the camera. Now camera is for let's say if you choose, if you select any object, whether you want this object to be visible in camera or not. So this is a very simple one. And second one is diffuse. Okay, now okay, I'll just deactivate these two lights, this one and this one. Okay, if I disable this diffuse, now see what is happening. This light is not affecting any of the diffuse surfaces. Okay, the only thing you can see is the glossy highlights. Now if I disable the glossy and leave the diffuse, you'll see the light is not visible in any of the glossy reflections. It only disappeared from the reflections, but the effect is still there. So you can play with these properties, and there are different scenarios. Let's say if I had some smoke in the scene and fog in the scene, and I don't want this light to affect the smoke or the fog, then this parameter is for that. Okay, so I'll bring up my lights back again. Okay, so I'll just reset my scene. I'll delete all these lights. So let's just set up a very basic light setup for the scene, just like we used for the shader tutorial in the previous one. So I'll go to the top view, and I'll create one area light over here. Okay, I'll scale this down and maybe rotate in this direction, like this, something like this. Okay, and so what I'll do now is I'll combine both kind of light. I'll use one environment shader from here. I'll bring up shader editor, and now what I'll do is I'll bring up one environment texture from here, and I'll open sunset.exr. Okay, and give this one 0.4 intensity. So I don't want this environment to affect my scene entirely, I mean, or overpower these lights. I just want to combine, I just want the dark areas to fill in. So I'll give it some Z rotation. Okay, so that we have this sun source in the back. Okay, so I'll go back to my camera view and go back to my 3D view over here. So right now the HDR is affecting the back of the scene and creating some nice rim light. So this light, I want to use this light just to fill in some just to highlight some part of the top side of these chocolates and the liquid. So I reduce this to only 1. I don't want this to be so bright, and maybe we can align this right on top of the chocolate over here, and I can also make a duplicate of this and place it somewhere over here, so that we, okay, so if I disable this one, you'll see this area is pretty dark, so I can bring a very subtle effect here. So I can bring one very low intensity light over here, just so that we have some interest on the colors over here. So as you can see, this scene, this light setup is starting to look like what we used for the shader scene. Okay, there are a few things we'll add over here. Now I can make a duplicate of this, and I want this to this light is just to add some visual interest on this area, so that I can see the surfaces of this cheese and the liquid part over here. Okay, it's light number 5. So now let's talk about the third category of the light, which is the emission shaders. Okay, I'll just make a duplicate of this scene, full copy, and I can actually rename these scenes. I'll call this one emission light setup, and I can call this scene mixed light setup, and I can call the scene number 1 HDRI lights. So from this scene I'm just going to reset the few things. I'll delete all the lights we created, and maybe we can go to the shader editor and disable the HDR. All right, so now let's talk about use of emission shader. Okay, and if you have a look around, all the lights which we use as artificial sources have some sort of a shape. Okay, even though you can use lamps for lighting up your scene, such as the interior lights and all, but sometimes you want the lights to have some sort of a form, okay, a shape. So for that, what you can do is you can apply emission shader on your object. In the first instance, I'll select this game screen. Okay, I'll create a new material for this one, just like in the previous chapter we discussed. Okay, so now the game screen is emitting a light. Okay, if you have a look around in the night time, the lights from the vehicles, the billboards, and the neon signs on the streets, or the LED lights on any electronic kind of surfaces, all those can be made with these emission shaders. And it's not just the color, but you can also bring up images to light up your scene. Okay, I'll just complete this one with a simple texture, gradient texture in the color to make it like a screen, and a converter color ramp to give it some color, just like a previous chapter. Nothing complicated. And yeah, okay, so we have one kind of a light source now. All right, now let's say you want a billboard in your scene. Okay, now I'll bring up one image over here. I'll rotate this one in 90 degrees and place it somewhere over here. I'll bring one more emission shader. Sorry. On the surface of this object, and now I can bring in some image texture. Now from the texture, if I choose image texture, and let's bring up the Pac-Man logo. Okay, something like this, and let's go back to the render view. Now you can use image textures for stuff like billboards, just like this one, and you can increase the intensity of it, if you want. And you can also use emission shader for a studio lighting setup. Let's say if you want some flat surfaces to be emitting lights and creating some strong reflections on these objects, so you can simply bring up some simple plane objects. Let's say if I go to the side view and make one 90-degree plane. In the top view, I'll place one over here. Now if you see, if we bring up emission shader, now you can use these kind of panels for studio light setup. Okay, and you can disable the camera visibility, so just that we have the lights, and or you can just play with these parameters and set up the way you want it. Okay, I'll bring one over here, bring one over here, so there are two light sources now. And also you can make neon signs with your emission shader. Let's say if I bring up one cube and give this one a wireframe modifier. Okay, and throw in one emission shader. Okay, I'll just delete these two. These were just for your reference. So you can make neon lights. Let's say if you have a logo in a wireframe format, okay, so you can just give it a emission shader, and that would be enough. Okay, so I'll just give this one some green color maybe, and what I can do is, just for fun, I can select this part over here, this part, and make a duplicate of this. Okay, now what I'll do is select only this face and delete the rest of them faces, and make one inset out of it, and delete this face and extrude this one. Okay, now what we can do is we can bring another emission shader and give this one some sort of a green color. Okay, and now the last part, the actual sources of emission which are being used here, these ones, I'll apply one simple shader for these as well. Okay, surface, and black body for color temperature. I'll select these two and transfer the material from this one, and go back to your scene, and now increase the intensity so that these should be very strong, maybe 50 or all right. So I think this gives you enough idea of this alternate light source, the emission shader. And now to finalize this scene is totally just to explain this shader. There is no specific kind of a look which I'm trying to achieve. I'll go to the world and enable my HDRI. From here I'll choose the night EXR, so that we have some sort of light source filling in the negative parts. Okay, now I can increase this, I can decrease this to maybe 0.3, and okay, I can leave it to 0.4 actually. Okay, or you can choose a studio light setup if you want. Okay, it's totally your call. Maybe I can change this to some better image. Why not my own logo, which is Crossmind. Color invert. I can bring one mix shader over here, bring one transparent BSDF, and I can make these black parts disappear with the help of the negative and positive of black and white. Okay, now there is one more fun thing you can do with emission shaders is you can combine them for with some other textures to create some effects like surfaces which actually emit light, such as lava. Okay, this wood material we have in the scene, what if we used emission shader and mixed with it? So what you can do is you can bring in a emission shader and bring in one mix shader. Okay, and combine these two shader, and in the factor you can use this texture. Okay, this texture we have created, you can bring that and put it in the factor value. Now let's bring one black body node, and now you can see this texture is actually being affected by emission one, and we have mixed it with the same values we have used for the base color. Okay, so you can create something interesting like a lava object or melted metal or something like that. Okay, so this is another use of emission shaders. Actually, emission shaders are what used shading volumetric effects such as fire and smoke. So now I'll just increase the intensity of this to 5, and maybe this factor value we are using over here, I can decrease the level of this with RGB curves so that not so much of it is brightened. Okay, so the original texture is this, and if I click on this one, you can see I made the texture a bit darker so that a very subtle effect over here. Okay, you can isolate this one to see the actual effect. All right, Alright, so now what I'll do is I'll just quickly take a render of each of the setup which we have done. It's I mean however basic they are, I'll just take renders. So the first one was with just the HDRI light, and I'll take a render of this one and maybe take another render with maybe of a different direction in HDRI. I mean maybe something like this, okay? And then we have one with a mixed light where the HDRI light, and there were few lamps, and the third one was with the emission shaders, where we used emission shader on a few of the objects. And then the fourth one was we used few emitting panels to set up something like a studio light, okay? And the last one what I did was I just took another render of the first scene where HDRI, and then there were a few lamps in the background, and I also added some emitting objects, okay? So this one is like with all kind of lights together, okay? So the screen is also emitting light, these filament is also emitting light, and there are local lamps just to highlight these parts of chocolate. So I'll quickly take renders of all these, and we'll compare all of them. Okay, so here we are. We have like a few of these renders put together. So as you can see, the result, the first one and this one, these two are with just the HDRI and nothing else, okay? Just the different direction of HDRI, and this one had like few lamps, the second setup. And then we talked about emission shaders, and this one is with the studio light setup with the white panels, and this one is the final render with all kind of lights, okay? I just added a little bit of glow in the post production, and that's about it, okay? So yeah, this concludes our lighting basic lighting tutorial for the Blender introduction series. And like once you are comfortable with all these tools, maybe one day we can talk about the principles of lighting, and how to set up different kind of lights for different subjects, such as portrait lighting and environment lighting, and how to light up a scene of a cinematic. In fact, our next series, which is Soul Stealer, once you are done with this tutorial, you can have a look at that tutorial once it comes out, or you can have a look at this tutorial series, which was about product advertisement, and how we set up lighting in this chapter. So we will conclude this series with one final chapter, which will come maybe in a few days, within this week, by the time you catch up with all this. So in this last chapter, we will work with the blueprints, and set up and see how to set up a blueprints of designs you have, and make a finished model out of it. And also we will texture it, shade it, and do some kind of a fun animation with it, just to conclude this entire series. And after that, maybe we can move on to little more advanced chapters, okay? Like always, I hope to see what you guys make out of this, and post your results of renders. And you can tag me on Instagram with instacrossmine. So hope to see you guys in the next session, and thank you, and we will see you in the next session.